All right. I am here with my friend Spencer Case to talk about moral realism because Spencer is something of an expert on the topic. Before we dive into that, do you want to say something by way of introduction to let everybody know who you are and where you're coming to us from?
Right now, I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for the Philosophy of Freedom at the University of Arizona in Tucson. Just started up with this job, but yeah, it's right now a research only position. I might do some teaching later, but I'm working on a book on patriotism. So hoping to have that finished up this year and hopefully out next year. But I have, as you know, been interested in this question of moral realism for a very long time. It was the subject of my dissertation and my first book, which is co-authored with Matt Lutz, called Is Morality Real? So, yeah, someone interested in the same questions you're interested in with these things.
All right. All right, cool. And I will just offer a bit of a plug there for Spencer's book, Is Morality Real? Is indeed a really good book, and everybody should go buy it. I am derelict in my duties as a host and not having my own copy to brandish at present, but yeah, it's a really good book. People should check it out. Okay, so to begin, do you want to just give us a kind of working definition? What is moral realism as you understand it?
Right. So this is the view that or, philosophers will say is moral realism. So a, you've got to sign on to a few different things. I'm going to critique this definition here in a minute because I
Yeah.
think there's some things about it that are not quite satisfying. But basically, that you've got three main planks. The first is that moral statements are meaningful. So if I say slavery is morally wrong, that has truth value. That statement is capable of being true or false. You might think, well, what does that contrast with? Well, it would contrast with sort of exclamations like boo or hooray, like that's not really a truth value to that. Or um, so we're talking about propositions that can be true or false. Okay. If you reject that first plank of realism, you're a non-cognitivist, or I guess you could just say expressivist now, because pretty much all non-cognitivists today, I think, are identify as expressivists. So expressivists think that moral statements are not susceptible of being true or false, at least not in the way other statements are. Rather, there are they are just sort of exclamations or ways of expressions of feelings, right? So
Mhm.
murder is wrong equals boo murder would be one way of cashing that out. Okay, maybe we'll talk more about expressivism later, but I hope not. I don't like that view at
Yeah,
all.
yeah, I'm with you there.
Uh, no, and then you get to the question like, okay, so number one, moral statements are meaningful. Number two, some of them are true. So there's at least one, the most minimal kind of answer to this would be there's at least one true moral statement. It might be that nobody's made that statement, one true moral proposition that isn't just utterly trivial, like wrong things are not right or something like that. But like slavery is wrong, murder is wrong, um, you know, some acts of self-sacrifice are noble and praiseworthy. Okay, so these are very good candidates for true ethical statements, and just one of them has to be true. If you deny that any of them are true, if you say yes, moral statements are meaningful, but they're all false, that gets you error theory or nihilism.
Mhm.
And then finally, they have to be objectively. There has to be one moral statement that is objectively true. So the the ground for the truth of moral statements can't be totally subjective. It can't be that yes, it's true that it's wrong to commit murder because I don't like it. I don't like committing murder, or because my culture judges it. Like that can't be the ground. It's got to be something independent of human judgment,
Right.
and independent of attitudes, right?
Right.
So yeah, so and if you deny that, you're a relativist or a subjectivist. Those terms are kind of used interchangeably. Um, so if there are true moral statements, but their truth depends fundamentally on subjectivity, then you're a subjectivist or a relativist. If you affirm all three of those statements, the moral propositions are, have truth value. Some of them are true, and they are objectively true. Then you're a realist, I would say. Some also want to say, like, add epistemic criteria to it. So, like, we have to be able to know some of the moral truths or something. And I tend to think that is a different that is a further claim. Although,
Hmm.
if you're a realist, presumably you think that.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. Okay, good. Yeah. So that's all really helpful. Now, is moral realism not just the common sense view of morality? Is this not just kind of like the view everybody's by default committed to? What do you think about that?
Yeah, a lot of realists do say that. Like David Enoch has this piece. Why I think it's called something like "Why I Believe in Objective Morality" or "Why I'm an objectivist about morality and so are you" or something like that. And he tries to argue that the reader presumably believes that there are objective moral truths. I'm not sure about that, because I think that there are a lot of people who just haven't reflected on these things at all. They don't have. It's not like there might not be any metaethical view that is like a default view, because I think like a lot of people just have not thought about this at all, haven't given it any thought. But I do think it's true that if you prompt people with certain sorts of questions, they tend to feel pushed to say that there is an objective morality. Like, for instance, if somebody steals your car and you presumably would want to say something to this person like that was wrong that you did this. Presumably you think it's true, like that it has truth value. Um, and presumably you would not be satisfied if the person said, "Oh, maybe it's wrong for you to steal cars, but it's not wrong for me because I have a different attitude or my culture has a different attitude." I mean, most people would not be like, "Oh, okay," uh, would not respond that way. So there are questions you can ask people that will elicit um, realist sounding answers. But I don't know, there are others ways of questioning students that might elicit different kinds of answers. So I'm not totally persuaded that it is the common sense view. I don't think it needs to be the common sense view for it to be the true view.
No. Yeah, it doesn't need to be, although you might think that it helps a little bit if this position just seems obviously correct to most people, that lends some kind of credence to it. Like if it turns out that moral anti-realism is a kind of odd outlier view in the grand scheme of things, then that seems to be kind of awkward for the anti-realist in a way that it's not if you hold the view that no, most people just don't really have a commitment one way or the other. So,
Do you think if it turned out that 90% of the population were actually some kind of relativist or subjectivist or error theorist or what have you, definitely not many people are expressivists. But if it turned out that the overwhelming majority of the population were anti-realists, do you think that would undercut the case for realism?
I mean, a little bit. It would be, yeah. I mean, I think that if you're a committed moral realist, then I would think you should probably, maybe rethink some things. Now, ultimately, I want to say that on reflection, one just should see that moral realism is true. But yeah, I think that there's some kind of there's some kind of value for the moral realist in establishing that it's something like the default position, which is why I think a lot of moral realists have been anxious to try and establish precisely that. And I mean, one thing I would add, I mean, is this kind of two points have seemed relevant to me here. So one is that you might think that even though most people haven't reflected on meta ethics, just like most people haven't reflected on metaphysics for that matter, moral realism is kind of implicit in their reactions and attitudes, right? Like with the kind of conviction that they have with respect to particular moral judgments, you might think is suggestive of a background commitment to moral realism that they themselves might not be aware of or able to articulate in something like the way that you might think that it's also implicit in people's ordinary behavior and just in the way that they talk about things, that they think there really are external world objects, even though most people haven't seriously considered philosophical skepticism. It seems like, the view that there are not really tables and chairs out there is not the common sense view, even if the ordinary person hasn't entertained that hypothesis at all.
No, that's a good comparison. I want to say it might be a little bit different in
Okay.
the realism case, although I would need to think about it more to see why. So I don't know exactly how to answer the question, but it does seem to me there are all sorts of things that might be implicit in my behavior that like I have never contemplated, and I wouldn't know that I'm committed to them. And I think that might be the position of a lot of like our students.
Yeah, yeah.
So I don't think people are I don't think moral realism is common sense in the way that there are other minds as common sense, probably. I don't think it's
Okay.
but I do think that it's true that if most people reflected on a certain line of questioning, they would see that, yeah, indeed, this seems implicit. Um, this seems implicit in their actions. It's funny. I heard a podcast with Don Loeb, who's one like error theorist,
Yeah, right.
and so he was he's eager to rebut the idea that moral realism is common sense, even in this weaker sense. And he says that the realist response to him is to say, well, you should. It's like what you're saying. It's like you should look at people's behavior and you should look at the way they use moral language, and you can just sort of see that it's implicit there. He's like, and his response to that was like, well, maybe they're like me, maybe they're, and I'm like, you mean confused? Maybe they're confused. Maybe they, yeah, because I don't really think that it makes sense to be any kind of anti-realist and hold on to our moral practices and like come up with these
Yeah.
elaborate rationalizations for holding on to moral language and that makes no sense to me. And in fact, that I think anyone should be able to see that it makes no sense. And I'm sort of baffled that people miss it.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a good bit there that we might get into going forward. But there was another point that I wanted to run past you that might lend support to the idea that moral realism is commonsensical, that most
Hmm.
people have subscribed to it, perhaps unknowingly, and that's just that most people throughout history have been religious, right? So that's always seemed like a kind of obvious point to me, and that the world religions entail a commitment to some kind of moral realism, so that there's something that seems just utterly confused about the idea to me, that people in cultural contexts, historical contexts in which religion was dominant were moral anti-realists. So this is why, like, the medieval scholastics were not debating moral realism. It was just, by my reading, it kind of didn't really occur to them that one might think there were not moral facts. It was just baked into their worldview. Whereas, as philosophers, intellectuals more generally, became more secular, less religious, increasingly atheistic, then the question of morality status became salient in a way that it wasn't before. And moreover, I would point out, like, I'm not aware of really any prominent anti-realists in the philosophical literature who who are theists, right? These are
Jonas Olson.
okay. So I figured you would have one, but you would you grant that the vast majority of them are not operating in a religious framework and they don't have God in their metaphysics?
Well, okay. So one thing is, I don't think at least certain forms of divine command theory count as realist,
Okay.
right? Um, I because I think the objectivity criterion has to mean that it's not moral facts aren't dependent on anyone's subjectivity, including God's. Uh,
Even if God is understood as a necessary perfect being.
yeah, yeah,
Oh, really?
uh,
Okay.
yeah. But most the kind of I think
I I disagree, but yeah.
the kind of divine command theory that makes really basic moral facts contingent on God's will is it's that's not been a popular view among intellectuals, even those intellectuals who are religious. So in the Christian tradition, William of Ockham comes close, although he seems to think that certain value facts are fundamental. So that certain things are good or bad are fundamental. You can find some examples of this in the Islamic context.
Hmm.
Um, but as far as popularly, I think lots of my students anyway who are religious, a they tend to be assuming a very crude form of divine command theory, which is basically things are wrong because God says so, and God doesn't say so for any further reason. God just says so.
Yeah.
Um, that to me, I think is anti-realism, and it makes me think that it's probably not true that
Yeah.
most people throughout time have been realists in what I would consider the most robust sense.
I mean, okay, so what I would want to say there is, yeah, I mean, I've encountered that as well, and it's true that, like, I very often students in such a context are disposed to pay lip service to to an implausible form of divine command theory, as you say. However, you might think that, well, what's going on there is that they are kind of bound up in a tradition that, best understood, is committed to, like, the defensible version of divine command theory. And they're not philosophers. Most people aren't philosophers, and so when they're kind of, when they're sort of under pressure, or they're feeling flustered, they're going to give, a philosophically inadequate account of their own meta ethic. But that's just kind of born of not being sensitive to the relevant philosophical considerations. And if you actually, like, look at the way they live their lives, it seems like, no, they're moral realists. They think that murder, kind of has to be wrong. Torturing babies for fun has to be wrong, and haven't realized that they're articulating their meta ethic in a way that makes morality implausibly contingent or something. Um,
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, I think that hmm, for sure, error theory has practical implications. I like, and I guess we can get into my reasons for thinking that
yeah.
in a minute. But like, I just don't think it makes sense to believe that there are no true moral statements, but then protest the war in Gaza or whatever as if you did.
Yeah.
I don't think
Yeah.
that makes any sense. I
Lots of people
I
are in
would
exactly that situation,
I
right?
know
It seems.
I know, but I would need to think more carefully about what the practical implications of a crude form of divine command theory might be.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
because even if you think that things are wrong because God says so or whatever, you presumably think God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and he isn't
Yeah.
just changing his preferences willy-nilly just for the hell of it. Uh,
Hmm.
you know, uh,
Yeah.
so so I don't know how that would affect day-to-day life, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know that that you could draw out a deep commitment to something like realism implicit in the behavior of those people. It could just be that they are conflicted. They've got you ask them certain lines of questions, and that will push them in a more realist direction. And if you ask them other directions, emphasizing God's omnipotence, like, oh, well, I guess an omnipotent God ought to be able to create moral reality. I mean, then they might
Yeah.
go in a different direction.
Yeah. 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 I think that my perception is that sometimes what's going on here is that people are, well, so for one thing, people tend to not like to have their fundamental commitments interrogated in the way that we do in philosophy. And so what's going on sometimes, I think, is that there's this sort of defensiveness that's kicking in, and that defensiveness also kind of leads people to to be defensive specifically of like God's greatness. Like, who are you to to like try and divorce morality from God? And so then they'll kind of like, you know, express a willingness to bite bullets that they probably shouldn't be biting. And I think it's not because they're moral anti-realists or something, unwittingly. It's because, like they're really committed to God's supremacy, and they want to sort of display that. That's at least that's a possible, like armchair explanation of what's going on. But it's somebody who has been in the classroom a good bit.
Yeah, I'd accept that, except I would say it's not that I would think that they are deep down anti-realists. I think they're deep down undecided about these questions.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
so I wouldn't claim them as secret like crypto
Yeah.
realists or crypto anti-realists.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, one thing I would just point on here, and then we can move on to other points, but is that I think it might be a consequence of holding that the ordinary person just kind of has no substantive meta-ethical commitments, that the ordinary person doesn't really have substantive philosophical commitments across the board. I think the kind of commitments that are going to deliver that conclusion in meta-ethics might just kind of deliver the consequence that most people are kind of living a philosophy-free existence.
No, I wouldn't want to go that far. And in fact, I do think probably all people are committed to the rejection of error theory in their everyday behavior. That I think people are committed to.
Okay.
I don't think they're probably committed to like robust realism, but I think I do think it's the case that treating certain things as wrong seems to imply that you don't accept at least some of the stronger versions of anti-realism. So I would think that.
Okay. Okay. Okay, good. So, so yeah, what the ordinary person is committed to is of interest, and we should care about that. But what we really care about is what's true, right? And so, with that reality in view, what are the reasons that are given for rejecting moral realism? What's maybe the most influential reason that philosophers who've thought carefully about these things would offer? Would you say?
Right. So probably the most influential one is one I don't take very seriously at all. That's the so-called queerness argument from Mackey, um, which I really think
Queerness had a different connotation at the time, we should say. Yeah,
that's
yeah,
right.
right. So it's like
It seems like you should have
the strangeness argument.
it's the
Yeah,
strangeness argument. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
It's that moral facts would just be so strange. They would be unlike any other kind of fact. And it's really an Occam's razor argument at the end. It's why complicate our ontology, why posit things that we, unnecessarily, right? the only evidence we have of their existence is our feelings, and maybe why not just say just our feelings exist and not posit these weird entities. So
Yeah.
there are actually two related arguments here, one of which I think is much better than the other. So the metaphysical one, it just tries to show that moral facts are just too weird, they couldn't exist. And I don't take that very seriously, honestly, as an argument.
Yeah.
Um,
Neither do
yeah,
I, but why? Um,
um, I just feel like what's happening is people are starting off with a kind of empiricism or physicalism and thinking like, oh, like moral facts, science doesn't say anything about those. That's
hmm,
weird. I guess we
yeah.
should not posit them. Um, but I guess if and I do think it's true, like there aren't if you think that the all that exists is the reality described by physics, you're going to have a hard time locating moral facts there, like nestled among the quarks or something like that.
Yeah.
And I think that's the kind of picture that makes people think that moral reality is just unacceptable. But I just think, well, then you should think that there's a broader ontology. Um, and it's true that yeah, you don't want to be too profligate in positing different kinds of entities, but you can definitely go too far with that. And if you go too far with Occam's razor, it's hard to get past solipsism, even. So I
Right.
I
Yeah.
I don't find the metaphysical argument compelling, but I do find the skeptical arguments a little bit more worrying. So the skeptical arguments um, would be to show that, well, if there were moral facts, we couldn't know about them, or we couldn't know about moral reality, or our what we take to be our reasons for believing that certain things are morally true. These reasons are undercut by all sorts of facts about how we came to acquire those beliefs through contingencies of evolution and culture and this kind of thing. I think that's a more serious argument. Um, I don't think it's decisive. Uh, Technically speaking, it would only get you as far as moral skepticism, which is the idea that we can't know what moral facts are true. But I do think that even though I don't classify skepticism as a kind of anti-realism,
Hmm.
it's anti-realism adjacent, which is why some people classify it as a kind of anti-realism. If it turns out that we can't know that the Holocaust was wrong, then it seems like it's hard to see why we would think there are any moral facts at all if we didn't have that basic knowledge, right?
Do you worry that there's a self-defeat type concern for the skeptic here, that on the one hand the skeptic says, well, we can't know the moral facts even if they're out there, but on the other hand the skeptic seems to think that he or she knows enough about the moral domain to know that we're not likely to have access to it, right? Like seems like there's some sort of tension there.
I was thinking you were going to go in a different direction with that
Hmm.
self-defeat argument. I mean,
Because in one respect, it seems like you have to know a good bit about morality or what morality might be in order to think that we're unlikely to have access to it.
I think that there might be a way around that argument
Okay.
just by saying, okay, realist, you tell us what you take morality to be. And you can describe it in general enough features, like it's supposed to apply to you independently of your desires. It's got, I mean, it's true though that even at the highest level of generality, like it just wouldn't be recognizably moral if it like had nothing to do with the interests of other people at all. Um, but you might think, okay, well, that's just a sort of semantic restriction. You know, the real
Hmm.
question is, are there reasons of any kind that are independent of our desires in some way that we could have access to, right? Um, and yeah, they're going to try to say, I guess there are different there are different levels of the skeptical argument. Some might just try to kick out the legs of saying that we can have any kind of access to this kind of knowledge. And I think the more troubling ones are a little bit more narrowly tailored, where they take particular moral claims and try to undercut those. And then if they can undercut enough of them, they could just say, well, who knows? Maybe we don't know anything about this.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. So another another potential worry that I see here for the skeptic is that they are maybe implicitly committing themselves to epistemic normativity that is stance independent, right? Like supposing that there are norms that are not just grounded in our concerns, our desires relating to how we ought to reason, right? Like what sort of claims we should commit ourselves to and why. And so the question for you, I guess, would be: A, are they committed to such epistemic norms, potentially stance independent epistemic norms? And B, if so, uh, does that not pose does that not sort of make the skepticism about moral normativity seem like it's kind of arbitrary or unmotivated or something?
Yes. Now, as you know, this is an argument I think is a good defense for the realist against this kind of line of attack. So is it possible to have skepticism about morality that doesn't overgeneralize and have a bunch of other get you more skepticism than you want?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one way of putting the problem. So it does seem like it does seem like even if you don't believe that there are moral reasons, you might think that there are that we have reasons of some kind, and you wouldn't want your argument against morality to completely refute the idea that we have any kind of reasons at all. Like it seems like you might think we just have like I have a practical reason not to, run into traffic,
Yeah, yeah,
or take a hammer and smash my face with it. It seems like I have a reason not to do that. Uh,
yep,
and it seems like I have reasons to believe things. Uh, and indeed, you might think that I have a reason to believe, you know, uh, moral skepticism of whatever kind you're pushing. I have some,
right,
if
right.
not, if you don't think I have any reason to do that, you don't think your argument gives me a reason to do that, it begins to become unclear, like what's even going on in the dialectic between us. Like
And
what?
yeah, and why the skeptic is making these
Yeah,
skeptical moves in the first place. Yeah,
and I think there is a way of being consistent about this, but you get to say some pretty bizarre stuff. You get to say like, okay, by epistemic reason, I don't mean anything that has any kind of authority of how we ought to think. I just mean like here's my definition of consistency with evidence in a completely formalized way. And that's all I mean by an epistemic reason. I'm not saying that
yeah,
you ought to believe according to the evidence. I just mean this kind of conformity to the evidence,
yeah,
which that raises problems, which is like, yeah, but not everyone is an evidentialist. Not everyone
right,
thinks that, yeah, like, um,
right.
so, so, so there's that, but also,
So the
um,
commitments just kind of keep piling up. In other words, it seems like.
I mean, you really have to do a lot of work
Hmm.
to avoid, if you really want to push this argument to its limits. I think there might be like a logically consistent way of doing it, but man, you are
That
really, yes.
no one has reason to believe potentially. Right?
Yeah, like
Yeah,
it's like you're running this obstacle course and crawling over broken glass and all this stuff, like, but you can't give me a reason why you're doing it, even by your own lights. It's like seems irrational. but it
Yeah.
just also it seems like if I'm arguing for some really counterintuitive moral position, but I'm a realist, I can say, well, like you ought to believe what I'm saying, and you ought to act
Yeah.
as if this gives you a reason to act in a certain way. Um, Whereas if I'm rejecting morality altogether, let's say that uh, presumably, if I'm in a conversation with you trying to persuade you, I take myself to be giving you a reason
Yeah.
that ought to be authoritative over your mind, right? Um, like Stan Hussey used to, I don't know if he still does this, but he used to defend like radical normative skepticism, reason skepticism, skepticism of all reasons. And he would try to get out of this by saying, I prefer reason skepticism. I hope you share my preference. It's like, okay, but if you're giving someone an argument, it just seems like you're trying to do more than get them to share your
Yeah.
preference. It's like like your argument is supposed to have some authority.
Yeah. 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 And I'll just note something that no doubt you've probably encountered more than I have, which is that there's a strange kind of moral energy that seems to underlie uh, a lot of the arguments for moral anti-realism, right? So like it seems like a lot of people are almost like on a moral mission to show that that morality is fake news or something, and that's there's something that seems very odd about that.
Yeah. Have you heard about the nice nihilism? I think Alex Rosenberg came
I've
up
heard
with
that term. Yeah, yeah,
came up with this idea. Like I saw somebody have a T-shirt, like a
yeah,
smiley face nihilism, like at
yeah.
a conference one time, and it's interesting that there's almost like a moral smugness
Mm-hmm.
attached to this kind of error theory, where they're like, well, I don't need there to be any of these weird metaphysical facts in order to just be nice to people.
Right, right.
Um, but you apparently need that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just like a naturally good person, although they don't say that, but like that's the tone in which this is conveyed. Um, it's weird. It sounds, I don't know. Um, like, because presumably, what do you mean by nice? Do you mean like we shouldn't punish people for committing violent crimes? Because punishment, that doesn't seem very nice. No, I mean, I accept some kind of morality, moral system of a kind a Democrat would support, roughly.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
and I'm
yeah.
calling that niceness.
Right.
And I'm just describing this as my preferences.
And
And
then oftentimes that's paired with like a really deep seething moral contempt for the other side, right? Of a kind that seems difficult to make sense of for someone who doesn't really think that morality is a thing. Um,
could you describe what you mean by that? Like contempt, like moral contempt for moral realism?
well,
Like,
I'm thinking about, so like a nice nihilist who, like has standard progressive politics and morality probably is going to get pretty worked up if you throw out a name like, say, Donald Trump, right? And so,
sure.
like, yeah, and so, like, there will be a kind of moral energy that, if not, logically inconsistent with, seems to just kind of pair unnaturally with a view that there's nothing to morality metaphysically.
It is weird. Now, what Matt Lutz will say,
A new weirdness argument.
yeah, yeah, what? Oh, the queerness argument against error theory. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
that's a great title for a paper. Um, what Matt Lutz will say, he's like, well, we care about the things we care about, and I care about, and when I go about my day-to-day life, um, using moral language, speaking with the ignorant, really, I'm just saying I should be interpreted charitably. I should, or I guess people like you and me who are privy to these sorts of arguments should understand that what he means is these are just things that I care about.
yeah,
Um, one thing I find really
No one says
strange.
this about Hitler, right? Like, so, oh, Hitler just happened to care about some things that were different from what I cared. Like, no one thinks that that's a satisfactory account of Hitler.
No, no, no. But he'll say, no, no, no. I really, really, really care about like not committing mass murder. And
Yeah,
so
yeah. I mean, what I'm
of
motivating
course,
there is just the thought that, most of us are, if we're not trying to defend an implausible meta ethic, most of us want to say, like, Hitler just got some stuff wrong, right? Like, he was just very
yeah,
obviously mistaken, and not
yeah,
not just empirically mistaken, he was morally mistaken
morally
about a bunch of
mistaken.
stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think they can account by for the I think they can account for the intensity of their reactions against genuinely wicked people by just saying, I just really, really, really dislike those behaviors, even though I'm not attributing any metaphysical moral status to any of this.
But then what they
What
can't
I
say is that it's good, like
That's right.
objectively that I have those concerns.
That's right. They can't say that, which seems like a cost, but also this is the point I wanted to get to about this, which
Yeah.
is why is it that all of the things that they purport to care most deeply about personally, purely subjectively, correspond so well with conventional morality in so
Hmm.
many different cases, right? Like, why is it that you don't ever encounter self-described error theorists who one of their most deep-seated commitments is like a dislike for some kind of food and they want everyone
Right.
else to dislike it, or something that would be noticeably morally bizarre, right? Is it
Yeah.
just a
Yeah.
coincidence that all of these people's most deep-seated um desires just happen to correspond so well with basic morality?
Right.
It's
Yeah.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
why would that be? um like you would think,
Or even that there's a kind of rational structure to them in the first place, you might think is
right,
somewhat surprising, right?
right.
Yeah, yeah. Like, why not just have what seemed like a very bizarre collection of intense concerns?
So like if you think of yeah, it's actually a good it's good I think to think here about like discussed reactions that we recognize have no moral content.
Hmm.
So for example, Aboriginal Australian people eating larvae, like these large larvae that they pull out of logs, like that seems really gross to me.
Yeah.
But I have no temptation to say that they're doing something wrong. In fact, that seems like it makes sense of how you would get protein in that harsh environment.
Yeah.
Um, so we recognize that, like, okay, we have an emotional reaction here, but it's not like a moral thing.
Hmm.
And I think the philosophical error theorists who don't want to be like functionally nihilists, they end up making this distinction too in practice, right? Like they have some like aesthetic reactions or just bare preferences that they don't project moral reactions onto, or don't use as a basis for condemning other people. And I want to know, like, well, why not? You,
Yeah. Yeah.
it just seems like an amazing coincidence that all of your strongest subjective reactions just correspond to something like common sense morality, like without even one really weird deviation. You'd expect there to be at least one. Like you'd expect somebody to say like pineapple on pizza is just wrong and mean it in the way that like wife beating is wrong.
Right.
If all of these things are at bottom is just arbitrarily chosen attitudes or something. Anyway,
Yeah. 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 Okay. All right. So kind of taking stock here, there's a case to be made for at least a kind of moral skepticism, but it comes at a pretty severe cost, I think you want to say.
at least, and
Yeah.
I'm not even entirely sure it is in the end coherent. Maybe it's logically consistent, but there's a sense in which it's not coherent because you have to think of yourself as being committed to your view in some
Yeah, yeah,
sense.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and
and yeah, and
to be
logic
committed to
itself
a view,
might be normative. So there's that too,
yeah,
I think. Yeah,
yeah. Um, so yeah, so there are all sorts of reasons why I think that the moral skepticism, which is, I think is the best way to resist realism, you're just going to end up with like only the only someone who is really, really, really motivated to reject objective morality would want to embrace all the consequences of going that
right.
route.
Yeah. So there, yeah, you got to bite bullets, and your teeth will be imperiled, given all
Yeah.
the bullets that must be bitten. Yeah. Okay, and so yeah, and then the queerness argument, I think we're in agreement there. I was going to heap a little bit more scorn on that. So reality itself is just weird, right? So singling out morality, it does seem very arbitrary, especially in the light of contemporary physics. I mean, go read what the physicists are saying just about physical reality, which we're supposed to think is, like uh, just like straight up reality, straightforward reality. Well, quantum mechanics tells us that physical reality itself is extremely strange. And then also, I think that yeah, the queerness type argument is parasitic on an implausible assumption, which is that there's like this really knockdown strong case for physicalism or materialism, and there's not. There's a whole host of problems totally unrelated to morality, for that kind of world picture. So okay, on another skeptical
Oh, just
line of
briefly
attack. Yeah,
on
yeah,
evolutionary
yeah.
debunking.
Well, that's where I
Briefly.
was going. That's where I was going next,
Oh,
right?
oh,
So
go ahead,
yeah,
go ahead.
yeah. No, so I was going to say, yeah. There's a kind of separate line of attack that comes by from evolutionary type considerations, made most famous by Sharon Street. But I'll let you explain what the evolutionary debunking argument is and what you would want to say in response to that.
I don't actually think evolution is doing all that much heavy lifting in this
Okay.
argument. I think people like to say it because it sounds scientific, evolutionary debunking. But basically, the basic kind of argument that it is does not. You could make a similar argument just talking about like cultural contingency.
Yeah, and Marx, I think, did exactly that, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so. But like, you can take basically the idea is, look, um, if you see that your beliefs have come about by a non-truth tracking process, you should reduce your confidence in those beliefs or maybe suspend judgment about them or change them. It should affect your stance toward your beliefs, right? So if you found out that you had been brainwashed to believe something that you believe, you might now, in discovering this, no longer be so confident about that because you saw your belief came through a process that was not truth tracking. So the thought would then be that, look, um, the evolutionary version of this argument says, well, look, you can fully explain. Actually, Matt puts this in terms of explanation. I do think this is an improvement on Sharon Street's argument. Um, so Matt's like, you can fully explain all of your moral reactions by evolution plus culture plus everything else.
Mm-hmm.
Um, had you been raised in a radically different culture or evolved under radically different circumstances, um, you would not think you would not have those same sorts of moral reactions. So that is in a gist. That's a skeptical argument in a nutshell. Um, I want to. I mean, one really quick way to push back against this, or to at least flag it as like, oh yeah, this seems like not decisive, is nobody seems to think that this is a good debunking argument for like practical reasons
Right.
generally.
Practical
Like,
reasons, epistemic reasons. Yeah.
yeah. So, you might remember that when Matt and I gave a presentation on this for the Nathan Bray, Steve Kirshner sort of book discussion group. I had a back and forth with Nathan Kaufness about this, and I wanted to say, like, look, like, do you have a reason? Will you accept that you've got a reason, like, not to put your hand on a burning stove? Like,
Mm.
couldn't you explain why you would think you have a reason not to put your hand on a burning stove through evolution from evolutionary reasons? Like, well, yeah, like if animals put their hands on burning things that are burning that will harm them, then they can't produce as many young and yeah, you can just the story here. And yet that doesn't make you question or like I'm guessing it's not going to make you question whether you actually have a reason not to harm yourself in all sorts of ways.
Yeah.
Um, like even if it's true that evolution pushes us in the direction to thinking that randomly harming yourself is bad, finding out that evolution has pushed you in that direction shouldn't make you think, oh, well, I just don't know whether it's actually bad for me to like stab myself in the eye with this pencil or something. Like, no, I know that's bad for me, you know. I suppose the thoroughgoing error theorist, and this is what Kaufness was gesturing in this direction. His response to me is to say, it is just to be a skeptic about those oughts too, and to say, yeah, I don't actually know whether it's good or bad for me um, to stab myself in the eye with this pencil. All I know is that evolution makes me dislike it. Um, okay, but I do not feel the slightest, I don't know, force of wanting to say that. Like it just seems
Hmm.
so obvious to me that we have reasons not to hurt ourselves, you
Yeah.
know, that if your skeptical argument is pushing you in that kind of a direction, then it seems like it's not an argument you want.
So, one popular response to the street style that, I mean, any kind of debunking argument, I suppose, is that evolution gave us the faculty of reason, and reason's kind of a bundle deal. It's a bundle package. And, so like the kind of rational capacities that would have been evolution, would have conduced to evolutionarily adaptive behaviors came bundled up with the ability to do calculus and uh, formal logic and stuff that wouldn't have helped anyone survive on the African savannah, and also gave us the ability to reason about morality and to access moral truths by way of reason. So, how do you feel about that as a response?
Well, I think that's true, but I don't know that saying that alone is a good enough response because you also have to say why evolution gave us this faculty of moral reasoning is the best explanation,
Mm.
right? Like, so there's still some work to be done there. Um, the reductio I've given, I think, shows there's got to be something wrong with it.
Yeah.
Um, but why it's not the best explanation, why evolution alone isn't the best explanation, I guess more needs to be said about that.
Okay.
But I do think that is a good part of the answer. What
Yeah,
you
yeah.
said
I
there.
actually agree that it's not going to be the complete answer, but maybe for a different reason than you do, but I'll come to that. Another thought on this to throw out there, I'm curious what you would say about this. So it seemed to me in thinking about this as I did somewhat carefully because I talked about this in a chapter of my dissertation, that the evolutionary debunking style arguments are less compelling the more uh, how to put they're less compelling the more difficult you think it is to be morally good. So what I mean by this is that, you know, if you kind of have a humdrum conception of morality, where morality is just, like you're being a morally good person, provided that you're not lying frivolously and murdering people and, like torturing puppies for fun and stuff. But like, as long as you're not doing those things, then like you're pretty much okay. But if you think instead morality demands a lot of this, it's quite demanding, as I think it probably is. Actually, I think we probably have duties of beneficence that far exceed common sense morality. Then if you think that's what the moral truth is, then evolution seems to account for that much more poorly, right? So yeah, like it doesn't seem at all plausible that there would be a good adaptive explanation of why I think that I have reasons to just like generally reduce suffering, for example, among all sentient creatures.
Yeah, or like another problem, this is a huge problem for this that doesn't get raised. If evolution is it has its fingerprints all over our moral intuitions, why don't people think like intuitively think deciding not to have kids is like one of the worst things you can do?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Like, why not? Like, that would be damn handy from the perspective of evolution and getting us to reproduce. And I am, in fact, a pro-natalist, but you have to argue for the position because people
yeah,
don't find it intuitive.
yeah,
Um, so it doesn't look like we're being micromanaged by evolution. Um, yeah, what it looks like is exactly something like the story that you said earlier, which is like, yes, we're social creatures. We have a certain sort of fellow feeling that gets us in the direction of being able to think philosophically about moral issues. But at that point, evolution is no longer giving us any specific direction. Um, and we know that it isn't because we have all this disagreement,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And at that point, we're in the level of we have to give each other arguments. And um, yeah, so
yeah. Seems right. Okay. Are there other arguments against moral realism that keep you up at night, or does that kind of exhaust the territory?
um, almost. There is
Okay.
one that I am a little bit worried about. Um, which is that if morality is totally independent of all human social construction and desires and all of that, if it really is objective in the way that we think physics is objective, then it could turn out to be unfathomably weird. Like the way physics
Mm,
has indeed turned out to be unfathomably weird with quantum mechanics. Um, it could turn like in principle, it could turn out that there is there is like a moral truth that is just like unbelievably bizarre.
hmm.
Um, you know, maybe it would take us a million years of cultural progress before we could even see that. I don't know. Um, and you might think that there's something deeply unsettling about the idea that there could be very deeply hidden moral duties that apply to everyone.
Mm, mm. Okay. Yeah,
So I think that's an under discussed
it
issue.
is. It is. Yeah, but I agree that's a real issue.
It's a real
Eh,
issue. I do think that there is like a foothold for a realist response here, and that has to do with the fact that in order to be like binding in the right sort of way, there has to be some sort of epistemic access criterion, right? Like, um, I do think that I guess there's a debate about blameworthiness and moral ignorance to be so Gideon Rosen thinks that you could be um, morally blameless based on moral ignorance, not just descriptive ignorance, if you could not have attained the moral knowledge that's necessary. Um, Aristotle disagrees. Aristotle thinks that it's sort of you're absolutely liable um, for acting on moral ignorance of any kind. And then Liz Harmon has like an intermediate position. So I do tend to think that at least maybe I wouldn't go as far as Rosen, who thinks that you could even basic moral facts you could be ignorant of in a non-culpable way. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not, but it does seem like someone could be ignorant about the right position on abortion or something like that in a way where we wouldn't blame them, or at least we wouldn't want to blame them very much.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
um, and it seems to me that like if there has to be a limit on like I don't think it makes sense for there to be moral facts that are impossible for like even an advanced civilization to uncover because they just couldn't be binding in the right way. We would have to there would have to be some reasonable path for their uncovery. But I don't know what more to say about this. There's not a big literature on this issue.
Okay. Well, maybe I should do what I'm sort of known for doing these days, which is to wheel God in at this point. So, like one thing I was thinking as you were saying this was that God could help with this and the skepticism concern as well, and the debunking stuff, right? So what I'm thinking here is that, well, if you have God in your ontology, then it seems like there's a reasonable expectation that God is not going to make morality like wildly counterintuitive or something, so that morality turns out to mostly be about, I don't know, attending to electrons or something, whereas it seems like there is no such guarantee for the atheist moral realist. So a couple more thoughts, and I'll let you react to like the God stuff generally. So that's one thought about maybe how God could help with that particular issue about like potentially just like very very weird morality. With respect to debunking, it seems like having God in the picture definitely is going to be helpful here because we can say, well, God is a perfect being, right? Is going to have reasons to bring it about that rational creatures like ourselves, A, would exist in the first place, and B, would actually get to the moral truths, right? So there might be a kind of explanatory payoff that you get there. By having God in the picture, sort of predicts that people would be having conversations like this one if God exists. Seems like that's a good thing for human beings to think about morality. Whereas if you don't have God in the picture, you might think, wow, it's like wildly coincidental that the universe just happened to spit out creatures like us that can morally deliberate and so on. And then finally, with respect to the related skeptical issue, yeah, I mean, God's not going to want us to be in the dark, right? With respect to morality. So yeah, so are there morality related reasons that you think might point in the direction of theism?
Well, I think the argument about the existence of sentient beings who are capable of deliberating about right and wrong. I think it's fair to say that does seem like some evidence of theism. Um, is it enough to outweigh the problems of like divine hiddenness and the problem of evil? I
I.e., the
don't
problem
know.
of evil.
What's that?
I.e., the problem of evil.
I
Uh,
yeah,
yeah, because I
yeah,
think
I
hidden. I
actually
think
think that too.
hiddenness is just
Yeah.
like it's part of the problem of evil, and like if there's an explanation of the most horrific forms of suffering, then that vindicates God's existence. There will be an explanation of divine hiddenness. But I digress. Sorry.
No. I think that's probably right. I think there's a way of constructing the divine hiddenness problem so it isn't a form of the problem of evil, but it's true that if you had a solution to the one, you know it should help with the other like a
Yeah.
very great deal. Some of the arguments. you're making though on God's behalf do have this sort of Deus ex machina flavor to me. They sort of like you're just any kind of problem you have, like have the guy on the stage come down with a rope and make everything fixed. I kind of and then I think this is a not so noble tradition of philosophical argument where you know making a bunch of skeptical arguments and then God comes and puts Humpty Dumpty back together again or whatever. I'm not
Okay,
into that.
so I disagree with that for this reason. God has been central to philosophical theorizing going back to the ancient world. In fact, lots of the great philosophers would say that philosophy really has to begin with God, actually. God is the fundamental existent. And so, if it were the case that like dreaming up this entity to come in and solve a philosophical problem, that would be one thing. But if instead I'm talking about, like potentially the ground of all being, whose existence we might think is evidenced by a bunch of different data points that we encounter, right? So, like, there are a bunch of independent reasons for thinking that God exists. Well, to then note that, oh, hey, like if that being, potentially the fundamental being exists, that would resolve some of these difficulties in meta ethics. That seems totally legitimate to me, and doesn't seem like a Deus ex machina.
Maybe, yeah, maybe if you're already, I
In
mean,
fact,
I've heard it
Aristotle
said
himself might say something along these lines, because lest we forget, Aristotle was some kind of weird theist. Um,
some kind, yeah. Yeah, it was interestingly enough, as I think you probably know, the unmoved mover for Aristotle. I just learned this a few years ago. It's a final end, not the not like a an efficient cause, but like a final cause. So it
yeah,
is that toward which everything
all
strives,
is oriented. That's right. Yeah, and
which
that's
is
why
which is
God. Yeah, so the prime
a
mover is also the source of teleology in nature.
yeah, it's a radically different notion of what the first mover is than what I had been thinking since I was an undergrad. I
Well,
don't know why that had to wait until I had my PhD for a few
yeah.
years before I
Well,
realized.
lots of philosophy instructors don't really do God justice these days. That's one of my hobby horses, but that's also for another episode where I'll just rant about this.
Not doing God justice. That sounds serious. Yeah.
Yeah, it
Um,
is serious, I'm afraid.
we have maybe some disagreements about theistic meta ethics to get to.
Yeah.
Uh, but I'll just state in a nutshell what I think about this. I do think there is a kind of theistic meta ethics that is realist, but I wouldn't call it any kind of divine command theory.
Okay.
So,
And
if
what is that? Yeah, if you want to give a
it's
gloss.
the view that God's like nature or being is the ground of all the
Mm-hmm.
moral truths. That doesn't seem like it's divine command theory because uh, the the God's subjective preferences aren't determining. It's not God's commands per se; it's its nature that is underlying morality. I I think that counts as moral realist. In fact, I could even hear a theist telling me like, what could possibly be more real as a foundation for morality than the maximally real being? If you have um, a kind of perfect being theology or something like that. So that seems like it's realism, but I don't think any kind of divine command theory where it's God's commandments that originate morality, I don't think that should count as realist.
Okay, so what about how would you situate this theory, which seems plausible to me? I don't endorse it, but the view would be I mean, you have to start, I think, with a decent model of God if you're going to potentially have a plausible version of divine command theory, and so that version would hold that God is perfect in all respects and necessary. Right? If you think that God is contingent, then and like so it could have been otherwise. might have failed to exist in some sense. That's not going to work. But if God's necessary, had to exist and had to exist with the particular nature that God has, then you can say that things are good to the extent that they, are in accordance with God's nature. They approximate God's nature, right? And that actions are permissible or impermissible or obligatory to the extent that they correspond or don't to the commands or the dictates of this perfect being. So that does not
So,
seem like a terrible or obviously false view to me. It definitely seems like a form of realism, but yeah, how do you react to that?
well, okay. So by perfect, do you mean morally perfect?
I think that yeah, omni-perfection would entail moral perfection. I don't know what it would. Yeah,
Right. Okay. So that does seem to be saying that that you have some standard of perfection in mind that and God meets that standard. But then it's no longer theistic
well,
metaphysics.
the standard would just be internal to God's nature because God's necessary. Remember on this view of things, so there won't be like worlds where there are facts of morality but not God or something, and then God's going to have a metaphysical primacy. So there will not be reasons, like that are more fundamental than God.
Yeah, that doesn't strike you as viciously circular, because it just seems like what you're saying is God meets God's own standard. I don't see how you get the kind of robust divine attributes you want out of that kind of view.
I think the way I've come to think of it is that this basically just is the view. Um, Goodness requires a ground, um, and it turns out that that ground just is a person. So goodness turns out to be a person. So Plato had the form of the good. It seems to me that it's open to a classical theist to say, well, God just is the form of the good. Um, Good is God, and vice versa.
I suppose one issue you're going to have with that, which I think you'll be okay with this, but I dislike the idea of analogical predication. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like if we're talking about, you know, God is good and Socrates is good, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
um, I have strongly the intuition that those terms have to be univocal. They have to mean the same thing applied to Socrates as applied to God. But a consequence of this view is that to say God is good means something different than to say Socrates is good. Like is good is a different kind of relation. God is goodness,
Mm-hmm.
and Socrates is not goodness, but he meets the standard of goodness or something like that. Whereas
Yeah.
I feel like no, no, no. Like when I hear God is good, in order for God to be worship worthy, he has to be good in the sense that we ordinarily mean it.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Mm-hmm.
what I think.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, so yeah, what I would certainly acknowledge is that you've got to pretty take on some pretty substantive metaphysical commitments in order to vindicate divine command theory. So I would now I might be willing to take those on, but yeah, it's it would certainly take some work, and probably what would at least register as bullets for some people would have to be bitten in the process. Yeah, yeah. Okay, all right. I'm becoming mindful of your time, so we'll wind things down here. I just Yeah. Did you have
Could I
something you wanted to say?
could I take a break? Could I take a break for a second?
Oh yeah, sure, sure. Hang on. I will. Let's see. Try to pause this. Right.
I'll be right back.
Okay. I'm pausing. Recording. All right. Recording in progress. We're back. Okay, so Spencer, you have a point about how it is that classification is done in this domain that you wanted to touch upon. So what are your thoughts there that you wanted to share?
So I think there's something weird about there's the semantic criterion and the metaphysical criterion in the first two planks as separate things. So the first the first question is cognitivism or non-cognitivism.
Mhm.
Are moral claims truth apt or not? And then you go and then you say if you say yes to that one, you go on to the next one, and you'll say, okay, are any of them true or not? And if you say no, then you're an error theorist or nihilist. Okay. The problem, or one thing that's bothered me about this for a long time anyway, is it just seems to me that if you say no, moral statements are meaningless, you're a nihilist or an error theorist. And we can see this, like if you consider what a positivist would say, like a very crude, like A.J. Ayer kind of positivist, who say like this, who says the statement "God exists" is meaningless. Well,
Right.
you're an atheist then.
One of the most insane things that's ever been said in the history of philosophy. But yeah, sorry.
But yeah, like there's not a truth or that. Uh, yeah, to say that God exists is a meaningless proposition,
Hmm.
and does God exist does not admit to a true or false answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I disagree strongly with both of those things, but I think obviously
Yeah.
if you say that the statement God exists is meaningless, you're an atheist.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
Isn't that
Right.
obvious?
Right. 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 Yes, that
Yeah.
is indeed
So
obvious. Yes.
so it just seems like if you say something similar in meta ethics, you're a nihilist. And
Yeah.
then maybe you're a nihilist who goes on to give us a bunch of philosophy of language bells and whistles, but I don't care
Hmm.
about any of that. You've answered the question I needed to know. You're a
Yeah.
nihilist. And uh, I don't really agree with the idea that expressivism is some separate track that is interestingly different.
Hmm.
It
Yeah.
is it is error theory plus metalinguistic bullshit. I That's all. So that might sound very harsh, but I don't see any way around it. Now there is a guy named Peter Vranas who has popularized, or not popularized, but he's got a paper arguing that expressivist realism is a possible view to have. Um, I haven't read the paper, but it does seem to me that like maybe it's a logically possible view to have, but if there are moral facts and you can say there are moral facts and there you're saying something truth apt,
Yeah.
then why would you not say that about like ordinary moral language? Why would you
Yeah.
say ordinary moral language is just like expressive and doesn't posit any moral properties? But oh, this one abstruse, metaphysician says there are moral facts that has truth value. It just seems totally unmotivated. So it's a possible view, but not one that has any kind of appeal. And in fact, the people who were defending expressivism originally, the original non-cognitivists, is pretty clear that they were error theorists who were uncomfortable socially giving up on moral language and so needed
Mm.
to come up
Yeah.
with some
Yeah.
excuse to keep talking, to keep giving lip service to the progressive causes that they supported despite being error theorists. And so they concocted this really complicated linguistic stuff that we can and should wholly ignore as total garbage. So
Right.
that is my maybe not so charitable but still accurate take on expressivism.
Yeah. I'm with you there. Yeah. I find that convincing. Um, okay. All right. Wrapping things up here. So let's see. I was going to ask you if there are findings from experimental philosophy. So, for the audience who may not be familiar, one project that's kind of taken off in relatively recent history in philosophy is philosophers kind of like reinventing ordinary language philosophy by going out in the world. At least in part, this is what they're doing: going out in the world and kind of like trying to, in an empirically rigorous way, figure out what the folk think about a bunch of stuff, and more broadly than that, just apply scientific methods to try and acquire data that might or might not bear upon important philosophical questions. So that's the background. Is there anything you've encountered in the XFI, as it's called, literature that you think bears upon moral realism, the case for or against?
Not really. I do know, Don Loeb has tried to push this. Like, well, if it doesn't even seem like moral realism is true to most people, then that seriously undercuts it. But I haven't looked into this deeply, but I assume if they're just asking people for their intuitions, like people who are not philosophers, um, I just don't think that's telling you that much, because it could be that the the kinds of things that would make you say that people are realists. You have to sort of sit down and talk to them and get them to think through things to recognize um the things that would pull them in a realist direction. So if you think that the I don't know that I would say that I'm committed to there being a common sense commitment to
Yeah,
realism, but in as much as there is, it is sort of not on the surface. So if you ask a bunch of people some questions and they don't immediately respond like they're realists, that doesn't refute anything that I thought
yeah,
initially.
yeah, agreed. And I know this, but I'll throw out there what I think is a relevant data, which is that according to the Phil Papers surveys, most philosophers are moral realists, right? And it seems like philosophers are better epistemically situated than the ordinary person to assess moral realism. So the fact that most philosophers do tend to be moral realists of some sort or another, maybe is like some kind of relevant evidence. It's certainly evidence if we're going to count what non-philosophers think as evidence, then certainly we should be concerned about what it is that philosophers think about this
Yeah, I
matter.
totally agree.
Yeah,
In
yeah,
fact, I would obviously I would think that would
yeah,
obviously be worth a lot more, right? Because
yeah,
these people are epistemic peers, or closer
hmm
to it.
yeah,
Um, the fact that most philosophers accept something doesn't mean that it's right, but it is a reason not to dismiss it as
yeah,
obviously completely stupid. If most people who've thought carefully about this, um, have a certain opinion, that
yeah,
should at
yeah,
least give you some pause before dismissing it.
yeah, yeah, and whereas there are lots of questions that you can be a professional philosopher and never really think about. Pretty much everybody thinks about ethics at some point, so we might think that the data there is maybe even more relevant than it would be in a lot of other, with respect to a lot of other philosophical questions.
Like 85% are atheists, though, I think, or agnostics.
Yes, I don't remember that it was that high, but in any case, yes. I mean, I was partially anticipating this response. Oh, most philosophers are atheists, but so like part of what I would say there, without getting up on my soapbox, is that most philosophers haven't actually thought all that carefully about the arguments for and against the existence of God. You can easily get a PhD in philosophy, teach philosophy for many years, and kind of be an ignoramus about the best arguments for the existence of God. Many such cases. So
I anticipate the anti-realist response that maybe they haven't been given the best anti-realist arguments either. I anticipate they would
yeah,
they would
yeah, yeah.
reply in kind. Yeah.
Yeah, but just my general thought is that most philosophers have kind of thought about meta ethics, in a more careful way than they have really about the existence of God. Um,
I don't know about
I
that,
would
but
go to the mat on that. Yeah, but okay. In any case, okay, and then the last, yeah, I guess the last question, unless there's anything else that you can think of that we haven't covered, is How long have you been a moral realist? I actually am genuinely curious about this. Like, do you think that you became a moral realist as a result of starting to study philosophy, or were you a moral realist before
No,
that? What's the story
before
there?
that. I would say
Okay.
before that. Yeah.
Okay.
I guess, yeah. So I guess it's true that I would see my work um, in philosophy as really trying to work out the reasons for a commitment I had all along. I think that's probably fair. I remember, I remember this one conversation I had in high school. I was like in a music class, but it was really a bullshit class. Like we were sitting around with guitars and not really practicing. We were just talking. It was like what, like a 1 credit or something class. But like I remember there's a discussion like, okay, if God allowed you to do one wrong thing, what would you do? And I was like, I don't know, I'd kill some dictator. And they would be like, yeah, but that wouldn't be wrong. And I'm like, you're right. And I guess if I could do any wrong thing, I still wouldn't, you know, because I don't want to do anything that's wrong, even if I could get away with it, you know. And so I guess it was at that moment that I decided I was committed to the idea that you should just be inherently committed to doing what's right, and it wasn't contingent on any kind of consequences, not even divine consequences. And so, yeah, I don't know when I became a realist, but certainly by that conversation, I already was one.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. I will say in my own case, I was a pretty moralistic late adolescent. I would say I had a lot of moral concerns that might have suggested that I was a moral realist, but I did. It would surprise people who know me now or have known me in the recent past. I did have a period as an undergrad where I was a very convinced anti-realist. I think it lasted for about a year, and that was because I decided that I needed to be a naturalist, probably some kind of materialist. And it's interesting for me to now look back and see that I just very straightforwardly thought that entailed moral anti-realism. And so I saw it as a kind of broader commitment to materialism, that I should be an anti-realist in the moral domain. And then I think it was moral realism that caused me to reject materialism. I became convinced that moral realism was true, and that the best kind of moral realism, the most possible kind, was going to be a non-naturalist form. And so I needed to reject materialism and naturalism. And so yeah, that was my path, like out of the cave, as I conceive of it, at least. Um, all right. Okay. Any closing thoughts, or yeah, final thoughts here?
Thank you for uh, thank you for inviting me, and please check out my own podcast, Microdigressions.
Yes, right. I should have plugged out at the beginning. I'll share a link and make sure that people can find that easily. But yeah, Spencer's podcast, Microdigressions, is one of my staple podcasts, and everybody should subscribe and listen and give a 5-star review and all the rest. Smash the like button, as they say on YouTube as well. Okay, yeah. So, Spencer, thanks so much for your time. This has been great. I hope it's of value to people, and we should do this again sometime about another topic.
Absolutely. Thank
All
you so
right.
much.
All right. Stop recording.